On the 8th of December 1980, the world lost one of its brightest voices. John Lennon was a former Beatle and a symbol of peace and rebellion. And then he was gunned down outside his New York City home. But behind the shocking headline is a story which is far more unsettling. John Lennon's murder came at the hands of a man who had once called himself a fan. Mark David Chapman had become so consumed by resentment and obsession that he saw murder as the only way forward. So how did a quiet, troubled man from Texas end up committing one of the most infamous acts of the century? Mark David Chapman was born on the 10th of May 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas. He entered the world into a family dynamic that would shape the course of the rest of his life. Mark's father David was a staff sergeant in the US Air Force. He was known as a stern and emotionally distant man. His first priority was his job, which meant his wife and children came a distant second. David was also a harsh disciplinarian, and he believed in strict punishment. At best, he was emotionally unavailable. At worst, he was cold, intimidating, and abusive. Mark's mother Diane was a nurse who worked long hours, which meant Mark was often left in the care of strangers while his parents worked. Their home was not filled with warmth or any kind of familial closeness. It was as if David and Diane had children because that's what was expected of them, rather than from a desire to build a loving family. 4 years after Mark was born, his sister Susan arrived to complete the family. Given how alone Mark often felt, the arrival of a sibling should have been a good thing. But Mark and Susan never shared a typical close-knit bond. The 4-year age difference and the fact that neither child had any experience with what love or affection looked like meant that as they were growing up, they were more like strangers who just happened to live under the same roof and share the same parents. While Mark's situation may not have been too different from many kids growing up in the 50s, this lack of emotional support would become a defining factor in his life. The emotional neglect left him in a constant state of inner turmoil. He struggled to understand the world around him and his place within it. This loneliness became a deep, festering wound that would shape the trajectory of his life. As Mark matured, he felt a deepening sense of loneliness and detachment from his family. Even though Mark had never experienced love, it is human nature to crave connection, affection, and belonging. From a young age, Mark exhibited signs of an active imagination. It's not uncommon in neglected kids for them to use this as a way to escape their home lives. Mark's fantasy world usually involved him playing the role of a superior, godlike figure. In this world, he was all-powerful, the one in charge, and able to manipulate his surroundings and the people inside it at will. As Mark got older, his fantasies became more elaborate and consuming. He would often retreat into this inner world for hours at a time. He was building fantasy scenarios where he focused his godlike wrath on anyone he perceived as phony or hypocritical. Mark was a below-average student and a loner. His teachers would later say that he was polite and quiet, but he struggled both academically and socially. But one thing Mark was good at was reading. Books gave him an opportunity to spend even more time in the world outside his own. He was particularly drawn to stories of fantasy and control. Soon, these fantasy scenarios began to center around real-life figures rather than imagined characters. He spent hours reading about people in positions of power, like celebrities and popular politicians. By the time Mark was a teenager, he saw himself as someone destined for a greater purpose, as someone who could reshape the world according to his own vision of truth and morality. When Mark was a teenager, he was introduced to religion, and this became another defining theme of his fantasies. Mark became deeply involved with a local Christian youth group. It was the first time he had experienced a sense of community and purpose, but as he grew older, his religious devotion took on an obsessive quality. He saw himself as a deeply moral person, and combined this with his existing belief that he was destined to play a significant role in the world, and he began to see himself as a real-life Messiah. In time, his internal world grew darker, and he felt increasingly disconnected from the phony world around him. But there was one light in amongst this darkness, and that came in the form of Beatles frontman John Lennon. Mark's obsession with John Lennon began just the same as any other fan, but it evolved into something far more dangerous. Just like many other Lennon fans, Mark was captivated by the Beatles and their music. But Mark also admired John Lennon for what he stood for. He saw him as a figure of rebellion and authenticity, and he admired the counter-cultural messages and peace activism that Lennon championed in the late 60s and early 70s. But towards the late 70s, Mark's feelings towards John Lennon began to shift. As Lennon became more famous and more popular, Mark felt that his luxurious celebrity lifestyle didn't align with the ideals of peace and humility he had been preaching in his music. Songs like Imagine spoke about a world without material possessions, borders, or religion. And yet, here was John Lennon living in a lavish New York City apartment, surrounded by wealth and enjoying the privileges of fame. To Mark, this felt like a personal betrayal. How could someone who advocated for a world without greed and materialism be living in luxury? These feelings were emerging at the same time as Mark's own mental health was deteriorating. In the previous years, he'd been fired from several jobs, until eventually he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. When he was discharged, he later returned to the same hospital to work as a janitor. Mark was well and truly into adulthood by this time, but no amount of maturity had handed him those things he desperately longed for: connection, affection, and love. That was until 1978, when there was hope that things could change for Mark. He had recently moved to Hawaii for a fresh start, and a few months in, he was introduced to Gloria Abe by a mutual friend. Gloria was from Hawaii, and she had dual Japanese and US citizenship. She worked as a travel agent and had organised a 6-week round-the-world trip that Mark took in 1978. After they met, the pair fell hard and fast for each other, and within a year, they were married and living together. Finally, Mark had found his person and the sense of love and connection he had craved all his life. But the thing with childhood neglect is that the bond a child has with their parents or caregivers is what teaches them how to treat a partner or loved one in the future. If a child sees violence and frames that as love, they are more likely to become violent with their future partner. Mark experienced violence, and he lacked a loving connection with anyone. So when he finally entered a relationship, he didn't know what to do with it. He'd simply never had a good example to learn from. So while the first few months of their marriage were fine, the familiar feelings of depression, loneliness, and resentment quickly began to creep back in. The connection he had with Gloria simply wasn't enough to fill the deep void which had been left by years of emotional neglect and unresolved trauma. Without a healthy foundation of how to nurture and sustain a relationship, Mark found himself drifting back into the darkness of his mind. His old habits, his depression, those feelings of isolation, they all took hold once again, and he began drinking to cope with his feelings. He began to withdraw, and he shut Gloria out as he sank deeper into his own world. It was the only place where he felt truly safe and in control. His depressive episodes grew more intense, and his inner turmoil seemed to magnify. Gloria tried her best to support Mark, but she was unequipped to address the root cause of his issues. She knew he was unwell, but she didn't have the language or understanding to know what could be done to help him. Instead, she became a bystander to his mental decline. By then, Mark had become completely obsessed with John Lennon. He had once been his hero, but now he was a prime target of Mark's disdain. He referred to the singer as a hypocrite, especially after John Lennon remarked that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. In Mark's mind, John Lennon's success and influence made his hypocrisy all the more offensive. Mark was also fixated on themes of authenticity and purity, thanks to his compulsive reading of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Mark strongly identified with Holden Caulfield, who is the book's protagonist. He despised the phoniness of the world, and Mark began to apply Holden's cynical outlook to real-life figures. Mark became obsessed with exposing Lennon for the fraud and hypocrite he was. He felt that his calling as a messiah was to punish well-known figures for their deceit, and John Lennon was just the first of many targets. As Mark's mental health unravelled, he isolated himself further from reality. He began feeding on the idea that he had to do something grand to make a mark on the world. It wouldn't be enough to write to a newspaper or speak out publicly. No, Mark believed that his mission required something far more drastic, something that would demand the world's attention. In his mind, the only way to do this was to kill John Lennon. By the end of his first year of marriage to Gloria, Mark's obsession fully consumed him. He spent all of his time planning the murder of his once idol. He tracked Lennon's every movement, read interviews to no end, and studied his life with a frightening level of detail. Mark's fixation on killing John Lennon began earlier than 1980, but it wasn't until October that year that he took steps to execute his plan. In Hawaii, he bought a .38 caliber revolver and began practicing at a shooting range to ensure he knew how to use the gun effectively. Then he made preparations for a trip to New York City, where John Lennon lived with his wife, Yoko Ono. In October 1980, Mark made the trip on his own. He staked out the Dakota apartment building where John lived and tried to catch a glimpse of him coming or going. But at some point during his trip, he watched the film Ordinary People, and Mark had a change of heart. The next day, he returned to Hawaii without carrying out his plan. Despite this moment of hesitation, his obsession with John Lennon didn't fade. Back in Hawaii, Mark began to refer to The Catcher in the Rye as his personal manifesto, as if he had written it himself. He carried the book everywhere he went, and he often used quotes from it during his interactions with others. He also signed letters to his friends as being from The Catcher in the Rye. In early December 1980, Mark made another trip to New York. He arrived in the Big Apple on the 6th of December with a .38 revolver and 5 hollow point bullets. He checked into the Sheraton Hotel and spent the next few days wandering around New York City. At one point, he visited a bookstore and purchased another copy of The Catcher in the Rye. On the inside cover of the book, he wrote, "This is my statement," and signed it Holden Caulfield. With the book in his pocket, Mark returned to the same spot outside the Dakota apartments to watch out for John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Just like his last visit, there were crowds of fans in the same spot, hoping to catch a glimpse of their idol. Those fans wanted to see John Lennon, maybe exchange a few words, or if they were lucky, get an autograph. But Mark's intentions were far darker. He wasn't there to celebrate Lennon's life. He was there to end it. For 2 days, Mark blended into the crowd and acted like any other admirer. He spent hours standing outside, fantasizing about the moment he would finally confront the man he had once idolized. And on the evening of the 8th of December, he got that moment. Mark was standing outside the Dakota when Lennon and Yoko Ono left for a recording session at their Record Plant studio. As they exited, Mark approached Lennon and asked him to sign a copy of his double fantasy album. Lennon stopped and signed the album for him. By chance, a photographer captured a picture of that moment. Little did anyone know that this seemingly ordinary interaction between a fan and a music icon would become one of the most chilling moments in history. Lennon had just signed an autograph for his own killer. Lennon continued on his way, and Mark spent the rest of the day awaiting his return. The time came at around 10:40 p.m. that evening when Lennon and Yoko returned to the Dakota. As they walked towards the entrance of the building, Mark emerged from the shadows, drew his .38 revolver, and fired 5 shots at Lennon from behind. He was hit 4 times in the back and shoulder. There are varying reports about whether Mark called out John's name or stayed silent as he fired those shots. The moments after those gunshots are a blur, but Lennon collapsed to the ground immediately. The police officers that were on hand to control the crowds could see that the gunshot wounds were severe and that an ambulance wouldn't arrive in time. So they put John Lennon in the back of a squad car and rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. John Lennon was 40 years old at the time of his murder. After Mark shot John Lennon, he didn't make any attempt to leave the scene. He calmly sat down on the sidewalk outside the Dakota as chaos erupted around him. As he sat on the ground, he began reading his copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He waited for more police to arrive, and when they did, he quietly surrendered. He was still holding the book in his hands as they put him into handcuffs. He later told the police that he felt like he had achieved his destiny by killing Lennon. He showed no signs of remorse. News of John Lennon's murder spread swiftly around the world. There was no social media, but it only took hours for headlines to declare the news. John Lennon, the beloved musician, peace activist, and former Beatle, had been shot and killed outside his home in New York City. For millions of people, it was a moment of disbelief and horror. Fans of John Lennon still speak of remembering exactly what they were doing when they heard about his death. By the next morning, vigils were being held around the world, with fans speaking about feeling like the world had suddenly lost a piece of its soul. People gathered in the streets, lit candles, and sang Lennon songs in tribute. Back in Hawaii, Gloria Abe was watching TV in the apartment she shared with her husband when she heard the news of John Lennon's murder. She said in a later interview that when the news report said the shooter was a male Caucasian, she knew immediately that it was Mark. According to Gloria, she knew all about Mark's obsession with killing John, but she never thought he would actually go through with it. She had never contacted mental health services about his deteriorating mental health, even after he showed her his gun and ammunition and told her about his plan. After Mark's arrest, his home was searched and investigators found evidence that he also considered murdering David Bowie, Johnny Carson, Elizabeth Taylor, Paul McCartney, and Ronald Reagan. Although Mark had admitted being the one to pull the trigger, his defense attorneys advised him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. They had enlisted 6 experts to assess his mental capacity, and all of them had concluded that he was psychotic, and 5 had diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. However, Mark refused to go along with their advice, and he said that God wanted him to plead guilty. He agreed with the prosecution experts who said he had a personality disorder, but he was not psychotic. According to court records, Mark was more cooperative during the prosecution assessments than he was with his own defense experts. Because of the unusual circumstances of the case, the judge was required to determine if Mark was competent to decide to go against his lawyer's advice. The judge determined that Mark was of sound mind and he was able to plead guilty to second-degree murder. At the time, this was the most serious murder charge available, with first-degree murder being reserved for the killings of members of law enforcement. During Mark's sentencing hearing, he read a passage from Catcher in the Rye. He received a sentence of 20 years to life in prison, 5 years less than the maximum available. He spent most of his time in solitary confinement due to fears of other inmates who were fans of John Lennon attacking him. Over the years, he has gone on various hunger strikes, and he has worked as a legal clerk and kitchen helper. For the first 6 years of Mark's imprisonment, he refused to speak to the press about the murder. During this time, he expressed no remorse or justification for what he had done. But in later years, he agreed to a single interview with a reporter from People magazine and sent voice recordings to another. In both instances, he said he regretted killing John Lennon, and he denied that his motive had been to gain notoriety. The tapes offered some insight into the mind of a killer and his reasons and justifications for his actions. Mark also confessed that it only took 3 months for him to become fully convinced that John Lennon needed to die. Quote, "I would listen to this music and I would get angry at him for saying in the song that he didn't believe in God, that he just believed in him and Yoko, and that he didn't believe in the Beatles. This was another thing that angered me. Even though this record had been done at least 10 years previously, I just wanted to scream out loud, who does he think he is, saying these things about God and heaven and the Beatles, saying that he doesn't believe in Jesus and things like that? At that point, my mind was going through a total blackness of anger and rage, so I brought the Lennon book home, into this Catcher in the Rye milieu, where my mindset is Holden Caulfield and anti-phoniness." End quote. According to later reports, Mark had a front row ticket to watch the play Elephant Man on Broadway for the night after he murdered Lennon. The leading actor in the play was David Bowie. In more recent years, Mark has also appeared in a 2020 interview with Barbara Walters and on Larry King Live. He became eligible for parole in the year 2000, but he has been denied release 13 times. This is mostly due to the board determining that the length of his imprisonment doesn't reflect the seriousness of the crime. He is also determined to be at a high risk of reoffending, despite a consistent record of good behaviour behind bars. Each time he has applied for parole, Yoko has written a letter to ask the board to keep him in jail. She believes that Mark's release would endanger her and their 2 sons. He will be eligible for parole again in 2025. Gloria has remained supportive of her husband for all of the intervening years since John Lennon's murder. She frequently travels from Hawaii to New York for conjugal visits. She refuses to leave Mark because of her Christian belief that divorce is wrong. This is despite Mark saying that he resented his wife for not contacting the police or mental health services, even though she knew he was planning on killing John and had bought a gun. Mark David Chapman's careful planning of John Lennon's murder showed just how deeply he was lost in his own delusions. He truly believed that killing him would somehow make Mark important and rid the world of phoniness. Yet in this twisted thinking, there's a clear contradiction. Mark saw himself as a man of values, even religiously driven, yet he ignored one of the most basic moral laws, thou shalt not kill. Ironically, he sought to punish Lennon for supposed hypocrisy, and yet Chapman himself became a prime example of it. Instead of making a statement, his actions revealed the depth of his own instability. Killing Lennon didn't give his life meaning. It just silenced someone whose message had always been about peace and unity. Yes, Mark's name is known, but his story is more about the destructive potential of obsession and self-delusion than it is about any deeper meaning or anything of lasting significance.